A widow stood alone in the cutting wind, an axe in her hands, when the wagon came for everything she had left. 2 men, 1 false paper, 7 days to be gone. They called it a debt. They called it the law. But she knew a lie when she saw one, because she knew her father's hand and the crippled thumb that could never have signed that name. She said nothing. She only watched them go, and behind her, the sky was turning the color of old iron, the first breath of a winter that meant to finish what those men had started. Every door in town would close against her. Every friend would look away. And somewhere on a frozen hillside, beneath a gnarled old pine, a dead man's secret waited in the dark for the daughter who was about to need it most. The cold was coming, and she would not run. The axe came down clean. The pine log split along its grain with a sound like something breaking that had waited a long time to break. The widow set the halves aside without looking at them. She placed another round on the block, and she swung again. She had been at it since first light, not because the cold demanded it, but because the work gave her hands something to do, while the rest of her waited for something she could not yet name. The sky above the flats had gone the color of old pewter overnight. The air carried a sharpness the old-timers knew. Not the end of autumn. Something more final than that. The first breath of a season that meant business. She was not a large woman. Anyone watching from the low-rise to the east might have thought her slight, until they saw the way her shoulders absorbed each blow without a wasted motion. What looked like size was something else. A density built over long years of work that asked everything of a body, and gave back nothing but the quiet certainty of knowing how. Her hair, gone gray at the temples, was pulled back and tied with a strip of leather. Her eyes stayed on the wood. She did not look up when the wagon appeared on the eastern track. She heard it, the creak of iron wheel rims on frozen ruts, the steady rhythm of a horse kept slow by someone in no hurry, because he believed he held all the time in the world. She heard it, and she split another log, then another. It was only after the 4th that she rested the axe head on the block, pulled off her right glove, and wiped a sliver of bark from her cheek. The wagon carried 2 men. She knew the first before she could make out his face. Something in the way he sat, upright, contained, as if the wagon were a throne he had merely chosen to make portable. Dorn Halliday. Past middle age now, his face dry and angular, the kind of face that gave nothing away because it had decided long ago that giving things away was for people who could afford the loss. Behind him on the bench sat the sheriff, Amos Cade, his gaze fixed on some point between the horizon and a place he clearly wished he were instead. The widow did not move toward them. She stood beside the block with the glove in her hand and waited for them to come to her. They stopped the wagon near the cabin door. Halliday climbed down without help, his boots settling into the frozen ground with a sound like something being declared. Cade stayed on the bench a moment longer than he needed to. Then he followed. Inside, the cabin held the smell of wood smoke and old coffee, and the clean mineral scent of the stone her father had used to seal the gaps between the logs. The table was pine, hand-planed, worn smooth in the center where 30 years of elbows and plates and open books had polished it into a gentle dip. Her father had built that table the same week he built the cabin. It had not moved from beneath the south window since. Halliday sat down without being invited. He placed a folded paper on the table between them. Smooth, deliberate. The way a man lays down a winning hand when he wants the other person to understand the game ended some time ago. A transfer of title, 200 acres, collateral against a debt now called due. A county seal pressed into the corner with the authority of a thing that asked no questions of itself. The widow looked at the signature for a long time. The room was quiet enough that she could hear the wind finding the gap above the east window, the one she had been meaning to pack with fresh clay before the real cold came. Her father's hand had been a slow, deliberate thing. The joints of his fingers, thickened over decades of gripping stone and cold iron, had given every letter a small tremor, a controlled hesitation between strokes, and the capital letter of his name. He had always made it in two separate movements, the curve breaking slightly before it rejoined. Because his right thumb, broken one hard winter long ago and never set quite straight, could not sustain a continuous curve without losing its pressure. The signature on the paper before her was a single, confident sweep. Round, unbroken, the mark of a hand that had never suffered anything. She did not say this. She folded the knowledge away into the quiet place inside her where she kept the things she did not yet know what to do with. Cade shifted his weight. The leather of his belt moved against the chair with a sound like something apologizing for itself. "The document's been affirmed," he said, his eyes on the table. "I don't have the authority to dispute what's been lawfully stamped." Halliday watched her with the patience of a man who had rehearsed this, and found her reaction, so far, to be exactly what he expected. "You have 7 days. His voice had the quality of a closing door, not slammed, simply shut. "Whatever you can load onto one wagon, you may take. The land, the cabin, everything fixed to the ground. It belongs to the estate now." She looked at him, and there was a silence between them that she made no effort to fill. He went on, because silence in others made him feel the need to prove he had already accounted for it. He spoke of the debt as a matter of record, of an obligation now settled. He spoke of it with the mild regret of a man discussing whether he had not caused, but was prepared to acknowledge. When he finished, the widow looked at Cade. Cade looked at the table. "I'll need to see to my stock before dark," she said. That was all. They left. She stood in the doorway and watched the wagon shrink along the eastern track until it was a small dark shape against the gray land, and then nothing at all. Then she went back to the block, and she picked up the axe. She split wood for another 2 hours. Not from anger. Anger spent itself in noise and left nothing useful behind. She split wood because the wood needed splitting. Because the stack against the north wall was still 4 courses short of what she'd need to reach spring. And because the rhythm of it gave her hand something to do, while the rest of her went to work on the problem, with the same quiet thoroughness her father had brought to setting stone. The problem was not the paper. The paper was false. And false things had a way of coming undone. If a person was patient enough to find the seam, the problem was time. 7 days was not enough to reach the county seat. Find someone willing to stand against a man who held notes on half the town, and return with anything that looked like the law. And the problem was money, because all of it was theory in the absence of money. And there was very little of that left in the tin box beneath the floorboard. She stacked the last of the split wood as the light began to fail. The clouds to the north had thickened through the afternoon, Their undersides had taken on that bruised, waiting look, the look that came before, not a gentle first snow, but something with intention behind it. She went inside, she lit the lamp, and she sat down at her father's table in the small circle of light with a stub of pencil and a single sheet of paper. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek, that high, scouring note that came before a change in the weather's ambitions. She thought about her father. Elias Calloway had not been a man given to explanation. He had been a man given to demonstration, to showing rather than telling, to letting the physical world carry the lesson. He had taught her to read the weather by watching how the horses stood in a field. He had taught her 100 things she'd learned so completely, she had stopped thinking of them as things she'd learned at all. And one summer, long ago, he had taken her up the rocky slope at the western edge of the land, the ground the local men called no-account land, too steep for grazing, too broken to plow. He had been digging there for 3 weeks before he ever brought her to see it. She had not understood then what he was building. She had not understood what he was giving her. She understood now. She looked down at the blank paper, and outside, in the gathering dark, the first snow had not yet fallen, but she could taste it in the air, that mineral absence of smell that came before snow, the way silence comes before a door swings open. Before the light came, she was already walking. The road into town ran along the creek, and she set out to arrive before the morning trade was done. The cold pressed at her back like a hand, not cruel yet, but learning to be. She walked with her chin tucked and her collar up, and the frozen ruts of the road rang faintly under her boots. The creek beside her had begun to still at its edges, thin lace of ice reaching in from the banks toward the dark water that still moved in the middle. She had walked this road 1,000 times. As a girl, running ahead of her father's slow, deliberate stride. As a young woman, carrying eggs to trade. As the woman she was now, older, quieter, her hands hard from a lifetime of work. The road had not changed, but something in the walking had, because this morning she was not going to town to trade or to visit or to hear the small news of small lives. She was going to measure the size of what stood against her. The town was small and knew itself to be small, which gave it a certain economy of pretense. One main street of board-fronted buildings, a church at the western end, a livery at the other, and between them, the compressed business of a place doing its best against the odds of weather and distance. Smoke rose from the chimneys in thin, upright columns. The air was still enough to let it climb. A few people moved along the boardwalk, wrapped against the cold, and 1 or 2 of them saw her coming. She marked the way they saw her, the small hesitation, the glance that slid away a moment too quickly, the greeting that did not quite arrive. It was subtle. A person not looking for it might have missed it. She was looking for it, and she found it in nearly every face. She went first to the lawyer, the only man in town who called himself one with any paper to support the claim. His office was a narrow room above the feed store, reached by a set of outside stairs that had gone slick with morning frost. He heard her out from behind his desk, his hands folded on the blotter, his expression the careful blankness of a man watching a situation he had already sorted into a drawer and closed. She laid it out plainly. The debt was false. The signature was false. Her father had signed no such paper, and she meant to prove it, and she needed a man who knew the law to help her do it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he told her he had a conflict. He used that word, conflict, with a careful sort of neutrality. He did not say what kind. He did not say who held the note on his own affairs, or what quiet word might have reached him in the night, the way it had reached the woman at the store. He only folded his hands a little tighter and looked at a point just past her shoulder. "I'm sorry," he said. And the sorry was real enough. That was the worst of it. He was a decent man being made to do an indecent thing, and he knew it, and he did it anyway. He did not meet her eyes when she stood to leave. She went down the frost-slick stairs slowly, one hand on the rail, one door, latched from the inside before she ever reached it. She went to the land office next, a low building near the middle of the street, with a stove that ticked in the corner, and a clerk behind a counter worn shiny by other people's troubles. He was a younger man and newer to the town, and he had not yet learned to hide what he felt as well as the lawyer had. He looked almost sorry to see her come in. She asked to see the record. He brought the book out and turned it toward her, and there it was, in the county's formal hand, the transfer, her father's name, Halliday's, the date, the debt, all of it set down as fact, as settled, as done. The record had already been changed. "Anything you'd want to challenge," the clerk said, low, as if the words might be overheard. "You'd have to take it a long way from here, to the seat, and you'd need papers drawn up proper, by a lawyer. The same lawyer, she supposed, who had just found his conflict. "How long," she asked, "to get there and back, this time of year?" The clerk did not answer with a number. He answered with his eyes, a look toward the north window, where the sky hung low and gray and waiting. A look that said, "Not before the snow. Not this year. Maybe not at all." She thanked him. He nodded, unhappy, and closed the book. 2 doors, now, both latched. She went to the general store last, not because she expected more there, but because the woman behind the counter had known her since she was small enough to reach only the lowest shelf. Della Hart. Her hair the faded red of a flag left too long in the weather. Her hands quick and sure, the way hands get when they have spent a lifetime measuring things out for other people. The bell above the door gave its small, tired ring as the widow stepped in, and Della did not look up right away. That in itself was the first wrong note. Della had always looked up. All those years, at that sound, she had looked up with something warm ready on her face. A word, a joke, the small news of the town. This time she kept her eyes on the shelf she was stocking, and her hands did not slow. "Morning," she said. That was all. The widow came to the counter and asked for simple things. Salt, a box of matches, a length of rope. Della's hands went to the shelf and stopped. For a long moment she stood with her back half turned, her fingers resting on a tin they did not pick up. Then she spoke, quietly, to the shelf, not the woman. "Your credit's been suspended." The stove ticked in the corner. Somewhere outside, a wagon passed. "It's not," Della started and stopped and started again. "I don't have a choice in it. He holds the note on all of this." A small motion of her hand, taking in the store, the shelves, the life she had built inside these 4 walls. "Word came yesterday. If I carry you," he calls it in. She did not say the name. She did not have to. The widow stood very still. She had known, walking in, that this door too might be closed. She had prepared herself for it. But there was a difference between a stranger closing a door and a friend being forced to. Della finally turned, and for the first time since the bell rang, she looked at the widow directly. And what was in her face was not coldness. It was something worse. It was the particular anguish of a person doing a cruel thing they have been left no room to refuse. "I'm sorry," Della said, barely above a breath. The widow held her eyes a moment. "I know," she said, and she meant it. She counted out the coins she had brought. It was enough for the salt and the matches, not the rope. She took what she could pay for, and at the door she paused, because behind the counter, through the gap in the curtain that led to the back room, she heard a sound, the scrape of a chair on a wooden floor, and then the small, unmistakable sounds of someone eating, the clink of a spoon against a bowl, the slow, careful chewing of a person taking their time. Della moved from behind the counter in that same moment, quick, too quick. A cup of something hot already in her hand, though the widow had not seen her pour it. Heading toward the back with a purpose that had arrived a half-second too soon to be casual. She saw the widow still standing at the door, and for just a flicker so brief a person not watching would have missed it entirely, something crossed her face. Alarm. Then it was gone, smoothed over, and Della said, "For the cat." Her voice did not change. Not in any way a person might later have called suspicious. Simply an explanation offered for a thing observed. The widow nodded, and she stepped out into the cold. She stood on the boardwalk a long moment. The wind had picked up while she was inside. It moved down the empty street, lifting a little loose snow that had gathered in the corners, carrying it in thin white ribbons along the boards. Because Della Hart did not keep a cat, she never had. The widow had known this since she was a child. Because Della's eyes swelled and watered within minutes of being near one. Any cat, any time. A fact that had been a small shared joke at every town gathering where someone carried a barn cat indoors, and Della had to step out to the porch, waving a handkerchief, laughing at herself. A cup of something hot, carried to a back room, for a cat that did not exist, and a scrape of a chair, and the sound of a person eating, slow and careful, the way the old eat. Someone was back there. Someone Della was feeding, warming, keeping. Someone whose presence had put that flicker of alarm on her face the instant she'd realized the widow might have heard. The widow filed it away in the same quiet place where she had folded the matter of the signature. The place where things she did not yet understand waited until she needed them. The minister's wife found her there on the boardwalk. A kind woman, soft-spoken, with the particular gentleness of a person who believes they are doing what they can, and suspects quietly that it may not be enough. She came up with her hands tucked into a shawl and her eyes full of a sympathy that was genuine and helpless and a little afraid. She had heard, she said. Everyone had heard. And she wanted the widow to know that if it came to it, if there was truly nowhere else, there was a room in the church attic. Small, cold, but out of the wind. Just until other arrangements could be made. The widow looked at her for a moment, and she saw, behind the kindness, the shape of what the offer really was. Not a rescue, a resting place. A warm corner where a defeated woman might be tucked away, out of sight, while the men who had defeated her went on about their business. It was offered in love. She did not doubt that. But love and defeat could wear the same coat. "Thank you," the widow said, and she declined, gently, firmly, the way a person declines a thing they have already thought all the way through. The minister's wife nodded, and her face fell a little, and she did not press. She only reached out and touched the widow's arm, briefly, and then drew her shawl tighter and went on down the boardwalk into the wind. Then the widow turned and began the long walk home, the salt and the matches in her coat pocket, the wind at her back now, pushing her along with a cold that had started to mean something. She walked and she thought, and by the time the cabin roof rose above the last low ridge, she understood the whole of it. Halliday had not simply filed a false paper. He had built a machine around it, a machine of suspended credit and withheld help and quiet pressure applied in 100 small places. All of it designed so that the paper would never need to be defended, only waited out. He did not need her beaten, not in any way that would leave a mark, or a memory, or a question in the town's mind. He needed her to run out of doors, to find everyone already latched. Until the plain arithmetic of her situation finished the work, his paper had only started. It was a thorough plan. She could appreciate the thoroughness of it, the way a person might appreciate a fine tool, built with great care, for a cruel purpose. But every machine was built by a man, and a man could only account for what he knew. Somewhere behind a curtain, in a warm back room, there was something Halliday did not know. She was almost sure of it. That night, she sat at the table again, and she let herself go back to the summer she had been young, and her father had walked her up the western slope. He had been digging for 3 weeks before he brought her to see it. The neighbors thought it was a root cellar. They had seen him hauling flat stones up from the creek bed in a borrowed cart, and a root cellar was a sensible thing, a practical thing. A small hole in the ground with a wooden door and a rough shelf for turnips. What he had cut into that south-facing slope was something else entirely. The room was larger than anything she had expected. 10 steps across, maybe more. The walls lined with flat stones, fitted together without mortar. A method he had taught himself over years of patient trial. Each stone chosen for the flatness of 2 opposing faces. Each one set to its neighbors with a precision that came not from forcing the stone, but from understanding how the stone already wanted to sit. "You don't make stone do a thing," he had told her, fitting one into place. "You find the thing it already wants to do, and you let it." The floor was earth, packed smooth. The ceiling was heavy timber, and above it, 2 feet of packed earth and sod. He had taken her hand and pressed her palm flat against the wall. The stone was cool, but not cold. A different quality of temperature altogether from the heavy heat of the day outside, where the air shimmered over the sagebrush and the horses stood switching their tails in whatever shade they could find. "The ground remembers," her father had said. He was not a poetic man, and the words had sounded less like poetry than like a fact stated in its simplest form. He tapped the wall with one thick finger, the finger of a hand that had spent its life among stone. The thumb of that hand set slightly wrong, healed crooked from a break he had taken one hard winter, working iron in the cold. deep enough below the frost line the cold can't reach. Hot day in summer, hard night in winter. Down here, it stays the same. The earth holds the warmth from the long days and won't let it go until the season comes round to put more back. Then he had shown her the two pipes, one set low in the wall near the floor, one running up through the roof timbers out into the light. He explained them with the seriousness he brought to all things made of iron and stone. The low pipe drew in cold, dense air from outside. It fed the fire. The high pipe let the warmer, lighter air rise and escape. It kept the breath in the room fresh, without giving up more heat than it had to. You need both, he told her. Without the one that draws in, the fire won't pull. Without the one that lets out, the air goes bad, and a person stops thinking clearly long before they understand why. He had made her repeat it back to him. Low pipe draws the cold in. High pipe lets the warm out. He had made her say it 3 times until it sat in her the way her own name sat in her. She had not understood then why it mattered so much that she remember. She had asked him why he was building it so far from the cabin. He had gone quiet, leaning on his shovel, looking out through the open mouth of the excavation at the pale summer valley below. "You prepare for the winter you don't see coming," he said at last. "A sickness, a fire, a failure of kindness, a man with a piece of paper." He had not explained why those 4 things sat together in his mind, or what had taught him to hold them side by side. What he had seen in his own long life that had taught a man to trust stone and earth more than he trusted the word of other men. He had simply handed her a stone and shown her where it needed to go. She had understood that day that she was being given something. She had not understood what. The lamp had burned low while she sat there, gone all the way back into that summer. The widow rose. She trimmed the wick, and she felt, for the first time since the wagon had come, something that was not quite hope, but stood in the same doorway hope would stand in. She knew where she was going. She knew what waited on that slope beneath the gnarled old pine at the crest, its bark grown thick over a mark he had cut into it long ago. But knowing a thing and reaching it were 2 different distances. There were still days between her and the 7th morning, and Halliday, she understood now, was not a man content to simply wait. The next day proved her right. It came in the smell first. She was at the woodpile when the wind shifted and carried it to her. Sharp, wrong, smoke where no smoke should be. She went at a walk that became a run. The east fence line, 3 rails of it, and one of the posts, blackened and still breathing thin gray threads into the cold air. Someone had piled dry brush against it in the night and set it burning. The frost and the still green wood had done half the work of putting it out. But the message was not in the damage. The message was that someone had come onto her land in the dark and wanted her to know it. She stood there a long moment, the cold biting at her, looking at the char. It was not a large loss. A day's work to mend, if she'd had a day to spare. But that was not the point of it. The point was to make her feel watched, to make the nights longer, to wear a thin place in her nerve, until the wearing did what the paper alone could not. She crouched and touched the cold, wet char, and looked out across the flats toward the town. She understood the intention. and she refused to give it the fear it had come for. She mended what she could with what she had, and she went back to her work. But she slept less easily after that, and she kept the axe closer. The fire on the fence was only the smaller half of what that day carried. By afternoon, word reached her the way small news travels in a small place, carried by a boy on an errand, half heard, half guessed, dropped almost by accident, and then snatched back as if he'd said too much. Halliday had let it be known, around town, that the widow had already gone, that she'd packed what she could and slipped away in the night, that the land was standing empty now, its former holder fled east to start again somewhere no one knew her. It was a small lie, and a clever one, because a woman who had fled could not be helped. A woman who had fled did not have neighbors wondering, quietly, over their own suppers, whether a wrong was being done to her right under their noses. A woman who had fled was already a settled matter, a closed book, a thing the town could stop thinking about with a clear conscience. He was closing the last door, not the door of the law, not the door of credit, the door of other people's sympathy. He was rewriting her in the mouths of the town from a woman being wronged into a woman already gone. And the widow understood, standing in her own dooryard in the failing light, that she no longer had until the 7th morning. The lie had shortened her time, because once the town believed her gone, it would take very little for that belief to become true. A blocked road, a quiet arrangement made in the certainty that no one was left to notice or to ask. She would have to move sooner than she had planned. That night was the hardest one. She would not have admitted it to anyone. There was no one to admit it to. But the cabin, in the dark, felt like a thing already lost. And the weight of what stood against her, the paper, the machine, the lie now moving through the town like water finding its level, pressed down on her with a physical heaviness she could not set aside. She sat at her father's table with her hands flat on the worn wood, and for a while she did not move. She thought about the room in the church attic, the kind offer, gently made, how easy it would be to take it, to let herself become a woman who had been wronged and had accepted a warm corner from those who pitied her, to stop. Her hands were shaking. She noticed it as if from a distance, the way she might notice a fault in someone else's work. She let them shake, and she let the tears come, finally, in the low lamplight, alone, where no one would ever know. Not the loud grief of anger, something quieter and harder to bear. The grief of a person who has been asked to carry more than seems fair, and has no one to hand any of it to. She cried for her father, who had died and left her alone with all this. She cried for the horse in the lean-to, growing old now, gray at the muzzle, who trusted her to know what to do, and had never once doubted that she would. She cried because she was tired and frightened and the cold was coming, and a powerful man had decided that she should simply cease to exist. And then, after a while, the crying stopped, because it had spent what it had to spend, and because underneath it, unmoved by any of it, the thing her father had built into her was still there. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, the same hand, and the same gesture she'd used to wipe the bark from her cheek the day the wagon came, and she understood something, sitting there, that steadied her more than any comfort could have. The tears had not weakened her. They had emptied out the part of her that could still be frightened into stopping. What was left was harder, cleaner, a thing with no more fear in it to be worn away. She thought of her father, leaning on his shovel in the summer light. You prepare for the winter you don't see coming. A man with a piece of paper. He had seen this. Not this man, not this paper, but this shape of trouble. He had held it in his mind long enough to dig a room in a hillside against the day it arrived. He had prepared for a winter he could not see, and in doing so, he had prepared for her. She had been the child carrying stones up from the creek, not understanding. She was the woman now, who understood. She stood. She turned the lamp up just enough to see by, and she began, in the deep quiet of that hardest night, to do the last things that needed doing. She found paper, and the pencil stub, and she made a list, in her father's careful, deliberate way. The things one wagon load could carry, the things that mattered, the salt, the matches, a whetstone, 2 wool blankets, the small iron pot, the axe. She would leave most of the furniture where it stood. She would leave the dishes stacked on the shelf. She would leave the curtains her mother had sewn from flowered sacking hanging in the windows, because taking them down would ask a kind of deliberate goodbye she was not yet ready to make. She worked through the list slowly, not with the frantic energy of someone fleeing, but with the measured attention of someone moving from one part of a plan to the next. Because that was what this was. She was not running. Running was what the lie had described. Running was what Halliday wanted the town to picture. A panicked woman diminishing down the eastern road, becoming someone else's problem, becoming nothing at all. What she was doing was something else entirely. She was moving from one part of her father's design to another. And that made all the difference. A woman running had left. A woman moving was still exactly where she meant to be. Near the bottom of the list, her pencil slowed. She wrote one more thing, not a supply, a name. The name of the old man she remembered from her childhood. The one who had come around now and then in the early years. The one her father had trusted with the kind of quiet trust he gave to almost no one. Josiah. She had not thought of him in years. She had half believed him gone from the world. But the name had risen up in her, unbidden, in the store, when she'd heard the scrape of a chair and the sound of someone eating, slow and careful, the way the old eat in a back room that held no cat. She did not yet know if it was him. She only knew that the name felt important, the way a stone feels right in the hand before you understand where it goes. Someone was being kept, behind that curtain, hidden, fed, protected, by a woman who had suspended a lifelong neighbor's credit with her eyes on a shelf, and then carried a hot cup to a cat that had never existed. The widow looked at the name a long moment, and she understood that Della Hart's coldness at the counter and the warmth she'd carried to that back room were not 2 different things. They were the same thing. A woman protecting something, at a cost, in the only way left to her. The widow did not yet know what was being protected, or who, but she knew, with the certainty her father had trusted more than any court, that it mattered, that somewhere in the machine Halliday had built, there was one part he did not know about, one thing he had failed to account for. And a machine, however thorough, is only as sound as the thing it has failed to account for. She set the pencil down. Outside, the wind had risen again in the cottonwoods. That high, scouring note. And under it now, something new. A stillness gathering behind the wind. The held breath of a sky making up its mind. She went to the window and looked out at the dark shape of the western slope, rising against a sky with no stars in it. The clouds had closed over everything. The snow was very close now. She could feel it the way a person feels a change in a room before they turn to see who has entered. She would go before dawn. She would leave the fire banked so that any early watcher would see thin smoke and believe the cabin still held a woman who could be waited out. And by the time anyone came to check, she would be gone from the place they were watching, and exactly where her father had meant for her to be. She looked once more around the room he had built. The table, the worn dip in its center, the shelves, the curtains that had been her mother's. She had already taken her last look the night before. There was nothing left in that room she had not already carried out in her mind. She would not need to look back at it. She turned down the lamp, and in the dark, with the wind rising and the first snow waiting just beyond the glass, the widow lay down for a few hours' rest, knowing that when she rose, she would not be fleeing anything. She would be answering something, a thing her father had set in motion long ago on a summer afternoon when he'd handed a young girl a stone and shown her where it needed to go. The winter he had not been able to see had finally come, and she was ready to meet it. She rose before the dark had any thought of breaking. The cabin was cold. The fire had burned down to a low red memory of itself in the grate. She did not build it back up. She banked it instead, careful, deliberate, raking the coals together and laying a single split log across them so that it would smolder slow and send a thin, honest thread of smoke up the chimney for hours yet. A woman still lived here, that smoke would say. A woman who could be waited out. By the time it lied, she would be gone. She dressed in layers, the way her father had taught her. Wool against the skin, then more wool. Then the heavy coat, worn thin at the elbows, but sound. She pulled on the gloves and picked up the canvas sack she had packed the night before. The salt, the matches, the whetstone, the 2 blankets, the small iron pot, the axe lashed to the outside where her hand could find it. Everything else she left. The dishes stacked on the shelf, the table with its worn, smooth center, where 30 years of elbows had polished the pine to a gentle dip. The curtains her mother had sewn from flowered sacking, hanging pale against the dark windows. She did not say goodbye to the room. She had made her peace with it in the night. There would be no comfort in a long last look, only a wound she did not have time to carry. She went out to the lean-to where the horse waited. An old gray mare, gone soft at the muzzle, patient as the ground itself. She had carried the widow and her father both across more years than most people ever gave a horse. She lifted her head at the woman's step and made a low sound in her chest, the way she always did when the woman came near. The widow pressed her forehead to the warm neck for a moment and breathed in the smell of her. Hay and dust and animal heat, the smell of every ordinary morning of her life. "Come on, old girl," she said, soft. "We've got somewhere to be." She tacked her up in the dark, by feel, her hands moving through the old motions without needing thought. Then she led the mare out into the cold. The snow had not yet begun, but it was close. so close she could taste it, that mineral absence in the air, that flat, waiting emptiness, like the held breath before a door swings open. She swung up into the saddle, settled her weight, and she turned the mare west, not east. East was the road the town believed she'd taken. East was the story Halliday had written for her. The fleeing woman, diminishing down the road, becoming someone else's problem, becoming nothing at all. West was the slope. West was the pine at the crest, and the mark cut into its bark long ago. And the thing her father had built into the hillside against a winter he could not see. She did not look back at the cabin, not because she was denying herself the sight. She had already seen it in the night and made it something she could carry without breaking. What lay ahead of her was the hill, and she was not running toward it. She was answering it. The first pale light began to lift the sky off the hills as she climbed. And that was when the snow began. Not gently, not with the soft, tentative drift of a first fall. It came down hard and granular, driven sideways on a wind out of the northwest. And within minutes, the tracks the mare left behind them were already filling in, softening, disappearing, as if the land itself were covering for her. The widow rode with her chin tucked and her eyes on the slope above, searching for the pine. She found it where she had known it would be, just below the crest of the hill's western shoulder, its trunk thick as a man's chest, its roots spread over the surface rock in a pattern that looked, at first glance, like nothing more than a tree's ordinary struggle to hold itself to hard ground. She knew better. She had helped set some of those stones a lifetime ago, with hands too small to understand what they were building. She dismounted, tied the mare to a low branch in what little shelter the tree could offer, and she began to clear the snow from around the roots with the side of her boot. The stones were there, flat, chosen, fitted into the slope so cleanly that they looked like they had always belonged to it, which, in a sense, they had been meant to. The largest stone, the slab that served as the door, was locked in place. Long winters of frost and root and slow, patient growth had knit its edges into the hillside. The roots of the old pine had crept across it, holding it down like fingers closed over something precious. Her father had told her once, without drama, where the seam was, where a bar or a stiff handle could find purchase. She used the axe handle, and she worked. It took her the better part of 2 hours. She worked methodically, resting when her arms gave out, then setting the handle again at a slightly different angle, throwing her weight against it, feeling for the give. The cold worked against her the whole time. Her fingers, inside the gloves, went from cold to painful, to something past pain that registered only as a loss of precision, a dullness, a slow refusal of the hands to do what the mind asked of them. The snow kept falling. The wind kept driving it into the collar of her coat, down her neck, into the small gaps at her wrists. Twice she stopped, certain the slab would not move, certain she had misremembered the seam, or that the years had sealed it past any woman's strength. And twice she made herself begin again. Because there was no other door. There was no room in a church attic that could save her from what was coming down out of that sky. There was only this stone, and getting it open, and what lay beneath. When the slab finally moved, a grinding, reluctant shift of stone against earth, stone against sky, The air that rose up from below stopped her completely. It was cool, not cold, a wholly different thing from the biting wind above. And it smelled. It smelled of dry earth and of time and of something faint and resinous underneath that she could not name at first. Then she placed it. Oil. The oil her father had used to treat the wooden crate he had sealed inside all those years ago, before he closed the entrance and let the hill take it back into itself. It smelled like a promise kept over a very long time. She struck a match, shielded it with her body against the wind, and looked down. The steps were there, just as he had built them. Flat stone, set level. 8 of them, descending into a dark the small light of the match could barely touch. For a moment she simply stood at the top of them, the snow at her back, the dark below. Then she went down. The chamber opened around her as her eyes adjusted. The walls stood straight and true. The timbers overhead were solid, unrotted, holding. The floor was earth, packed smooth by hands that had gone still years ago. Against the far wall, she could make out the orderly shapes of stacked supplies, the geometry of a man who had planned ahead and packed with care, and trusted that someday the right person would come down these steps and find what he had left. She let the first match die. Stood a moment in the dark, one hand flat on the cool stone wall. It felt under her palm, exactly as it had felt the summer she was young. When he had pressed her small hand there and said, "The ground remembers." The ground had remembered. Through every winter and every summer since, it had held what he built, and waited. Then she climbed back up. She untied the mare and coaxed her down the steps, one careful hoof at a time, into the shelter of the outer chamber. The animal balked at the dark mouth of it, and the widow stood with her and spoke to her low, until the trust between them did what force never could. The mare's warmth would matter down here. Everything would matter now. And then she lit the lamp she found waiting on the crate, its wick trimmed and ready, its small reservoir of oil still good after all the years. The chamber came into full light for the first time in more than a decade. On the flat top of the wooden crate, she found the pouch. Oil skin, stiff with age, but sound. Whatever lay inside had been kept dry through every season since he sealed the door. Her hands were shaking again, not from cold this time. She opened it. Inside were 2 things. The first was a document, a certificate of title, the real one, the one that had never sat in any county record office, because her father had trusted stone more than he had ever trusted paper kept by other men. 2 signatures at the bottom, beside her father's own, witnesses to the true granting of the land. One name she did not know, and one she did. Josiah, the name from the store, the name that had risen in her, unbidden, at the sound of a chair scraping in a back room that held no cat. She stared at it a long moment in the lamplight. The old man Della was hiding. The old man being fed and warmed and kept out of sight behind a curtain. He was not just some stranger taking shelter. He was a witness, a living hand that had signed the true paper. The paper that could unmake everything Halliday had built. The pieces turned in her mind, and turned, and began to fit. Della's coldness at the counter, the cup of something hot, carried to a cat that did not exist, the flicker of alarm when she'd realized the widow might have heard. She had not been protecting a secret out of spite. She had been protecting a man, the one man in the world who could win this. The second thing in the pouch was a single sheet of paper, her father's hand, that careful, deliberate script, each letter shaped like a small act of labor, not a letter, not an explanation, just a few words. If you found this, you know what the paper means. Find Josiah. She read it 3 times. Then she stood in the underground dark with both papers in her hands, the cool stone pressing in around her, the wind above completely silenced now, filtered out by earth and time and the patient architecture of a man who had trusted the physical world more than any court in any county. He had known, not the name of the man who would come, not the exact shape of the paper that would be laid on his table, but the shape of the trouble, the winter he could not see. And he had left her not just a shelter to survive it. He had left her a way to win it. A sob rose in her, sudden and unbidden, and she let it come, just once, standing there in the lamplight. Not grief, something more complicated than grief. The feeling of a hand reaching out of the past to steady her at the exact moment she had thought herself most alone. Find Josiah. She would. But first, she had to live long enough to do it. She folded both papers and returned them to the pouch and pressed the pouch inside her coat against her ribs, where it would stay. Then she looked around the chamber. Really looked. At the stacked sacks of dried beans, the tins of coffee, the 2 sealed barrels, their lids waxed against the years, the tools arranged against the wall with the quiet order of things placed with the expectation of being found and used. And at the pipes, the low one near the floor, the high one running up through the timbers toward the surface. Low pipe draws the cold in. High pipe lets the warm out. The words came back the way her own name came back to her. She had a home now, or the bones of one. The rest she would have to build with her own 2 hands. She picked up the short-handled shovel, and she got to work. The first thing she built was the cold sink. Not the stove, not the bed, not the ceiling of the door, though all of those pressed on her as more urgent. The cold sink came first, because her father had explained it first, with a weight in his voice that told her he considered it the foundation of everything else. Cold air was heavy, he had said. It settled, it pooled, and without somewhere deliberate for it to go, it would spread across the floor in an invisible layer, pulling the heat out of everything it touched, out of a sleeping body faster than the walls ever could. So she dug a trench 6 inches deep along the base of the walls on 3 sides, leaving the 4th open near the entrance, the way he had told her. The earth she dug out, she packed against the inside of the door slab, her boots stamping it firm, building a thicker barrier against the cold that would try to press in through the seam. The work warmed her. That was its own kind of instruction. By the time the trench was done, her shoulders ached in that specific, deep way she knew and trusted. The good ache. The ache that meant the body had been properly used. She rested, ate a handful of dried beans straight from the sack, drank cold water from the pot. Then she turned to the stove. Her father had left a pile of stones in one corner. Not random stones, chosen ones, each flat on at least 2 faces, sorted roughly by size, waiting. He had thought ahead to this exact hour, with the patience of a man who understood that good preparation looks like foolish excess, right up until the moment it looks like salvation. She sorted through them, flattest pieces for the base courses, the more irregular ones for the upper structure, where she could turn their imperfections into a natural channel to draw the fire. She built slowly, each stone set, tested with her palm for wobble, adjusted, tested again. For mortar, she dug clay from the floor near the east wall, where the soil changed color, going from pale tan at the surface to a dense blue-gray deeper down. She mixed it with dry grass from a bundle her father had left hanging on a peg, working it in her hands until it moved like wet bread dough, then packing it into the joints with her thumb. There was a rhythm to it, an old rhythm, older than her, the rhythm of a hand fitting stone to stone. She understood as she worked that she was doing the thing her father had done his whole life, that her hands had learned it from watching his, that in this small, dark room, she was closer to him than she had been since the day they laid him in the ground. The stove took the better part of 2 days to build, and when it was done, she fit the flue, a length of hollowed log her father had prepared and stored, its inside smoothed by patient work with a long auger. She packed clay where it passed up through the roof timbers, working around the existing pipes to keep them clear. And then she made her first serious mistake. She had been so focused on the stove itself, on the clay joints, and whether they had cured, on the thermal mass of the river stones she meant to heat, on the fit of the flue, the draw of the fire. She had been thinking about heat. She had not been thinking about the pipes. In the dark, working by feel, tired past the point of caution, sure of her own competence, she had connected the flue wrong. She lit the first fire. She watched it catch, felt the first real warmth radiate off the stone, and something in her chest loosened, thinking, there, done, safe. And then the smoke came back. It did not curl gently up and out. It poured, thick and gray, filling the lower half of the chamber in the time it took her to understand what was happening. Her eyes burned. Her chest seized. The lamp light went dim and swimming in the murk. She dropped to her hands and knees, where the air was still breathable, her mind racing through her father's words. Low pipe draws the cold in. High pipe lets the warm out. She had sealed the flue beside the high pipe. That was right. She had packed the clay around both. That was right. She had, and then she understood. She had crossed the draw. The smoke was being pulled toward the intake instead of the exhaust. She had reversed it. In the dark, tired, certain she knew, she had made the one mistake that could kill her down here, in the very room built to keep her alive. Her father's voice came back to her from that summer afternoon. The air goes bad, and a person stops thinking clearly long before they understand why. He had warned her. He had made her say it 3 times, and still, in her confidence, she had gotten it wrong. She crawled to the entrance, shoved the door slab with both arms until it ground open a hand's width, pressed her face to the gap, and breathed. The outside air hit her like cold water thrown in the face of a sleeping person. Clarifying, total, without mercy, and without apology. She lay there a full minute, letting the smoke find its way out around her, letting her lungs remember how to work. The snow blew in through the gap and settled on her hair, and she did not move, only breathed and breathed and breathed. And when she could stand again, she went back in, and she fixed it. It took 2 hours of careful work in the near dark, repacking the clay, reversing the connection, waiting, coughing, for the smoke to clear enough to see whether the repair had held. She built the fire again, small this time, a handful of kindling no bigger than her thumb, and the smoke went up. The draft held, clean and steady, drawing the way her father had promised it would draw. She sat down on the earthen floor, her back against the cool stone, and let her hands shake for a moment. Not from cold. She had been frightened. And being frightened, she understood, was information. It told her she had been moving too fast, trusting confidence in a place that demanded precision, believing that because she loved her father and remembered his words, the work would simply come right. It would not simply come right. It would come right only if she was humble enough to do it exactly as he had shown her. Not almost, not nearly, exactly. She would not make that mistake again. Her father had not built this place for a woman who thought she already knew. He had built it for a woman who would learn. And she was learning. She built quietly after that, slower, more careful. And as she worked, the mare stood patient in the outer chamber, and the lamp burned steady, and the small stove ticked and settled as its stones took the heat and gave it slowly back. For the first time since the wagon had come up the eastern track, the widow was warm, not comfortable, not safe, not yet, but warm, in a room her father had cut into the earth against exactly this hour of her life. And that was enough to build the rest upon. Then, on the third evening, the sound above the hill changed. She heard it before she understood it. A shift in the quality of the silence. A new register in the way the wind moved across the crest of the slope, as if the air itself had stopped pretending and decided at last to show what it truly was. The temperature dropped hard in the space of an afternoon. She could feel it press against the door slab, testing the seam, searching patiently for a way in. That evening, the intake pipe began to whistle, a thin, urgent, rising note, and she knew, listening to it, that what was coming was not a storm in any ordinary sense. It was a siege, something vast and patient and without pity, settling over the hill, meaning to stay. She spent the last hours before full dark doing what could still be done. She gathered the pine boughs she had cut and stored and stuffed them around the perimeter of the door slab, packing them into every seam until no thread of cold could find its way through. Inside, she strung rope between the roof timbers, rope her father had left coiled on the crate for this very purpose, and hung the 2 heavy wool blankets from it, making a smaller room within the room. A tent, just large enough for a sleeping pallet. It would cut the space she had to keep warm by more than half. And she understood, tying off the last knot, that this too he had foreseen. The rope, the pegs set into the timbers at just the right span. Nothing here was accident. He had thought it all through, on that summer afternoon and the long evenings before it, sitting with the shape of a trouble he could not name but somehow knew would come to find his daughter. She pulled the mare closer to the entrance, where the animal's warmth would stand as a living buffer against the cold seeping through the door. And then she sealed herself in. She lit the stove to its working heat, fed it the disciplined small fire her father's design demanded. And she waited. Above her, the full weight of it arrived. What came down was not weather in any ordinary sense. It was a force with the quality of intention, a wind that shook the ground above her in deep, rhythmic concussions, like something enormous testing the roof of the world. Snow that scoured the hillside and packed itself into every fold and hollow with a density that would resist a shovel for days to come. And inside the chamber, with the door sealed and the boughs packed tight, and the blanket tent holding the stove's small heat close around her, the sounds arrived muffled, distant, filtered through 2 feet of packed earth and stone. The storm was real. The storm was absolute. And she was somewhere outside its reach. She heated 3 river stones on the surface of the stove. When they were hot enough to make a drop of water hiss and vanish on contact, she carried them one at a time into the blanket tent, using folded canvas to spare her hands, and set them near her pallet. She sealed the flap, and within that small, close space, the temperature climbed. The cold that had been pressing at her from every direction drew back. Not entirely, not forever, but enough. She lay down on the pallet of pine needles and wool, and she listened to the storm laboring at the hill above her. And she felt something she had not let herself feel since the day Halliday laid his false paper on her father's table. It was not relief. It was something sturdier than relief. A recognition that the things her father had trusted, stone and earth and the plain physics of heat rising and cold settling, were holding. Keeping their end of a bargain made long ago on a summer afternoon, when a young girl had carried rocks up from a creek bed without understanding why. The old thermometer he had left showed the main chamber holding steady, far above the killing cold beyond the door. Inside the tent, warmer still. The world overhead had gone to the deep negatives, the kind of cold that turned exposed water to ice in minutes, and would not spare anything caught out in it. The distance between that world and her own was a few feet of earth, and a father's foresight, reaching across all the years between them. She woke once in the deep of the night, the mare shifting and restless in the outer chamber, her hooves grinding at the edge of the cold sink trench. The widow rose and went out into the colder air of the main room and put her hand on the animal's neck. Warm, alert, uneasy, but not afraid. "Easy, old girl," she murmured. She fed her a measure of oats from the sack and stood with her a while in the dark, her forehead against the warm neck, feeling the heat that came off the big body like a banked fire. "You're all right," she told her. "We both are." And for that night, at least, it was true. Above them, the storm went on, blind and vast and indifferent, throwing itself against a hillside that did not so much as notice, and beneath it, in a room cut from stone and earth and a dead man's love, a woman and an old gray mare kept each other warm and waited for the world to remember spring. She did not know yet how long the siege would last. She did not know what the cold would ask of her before it was done, or what it would take, or who would come stumbling to her door out of the white. But she knew the papers were dry against her ribs. She knew the name written in her father's hand. And she knew, listening to the storm break itself against the patient stone above her, that she had already survived the thing Halliday had counted on to finish her. She had not run. She had gone to ground in the place her father built, and she was still exactly where she meant to be. The siege lasted 4 days. 4 days of the wind laboring at the hill, and the snow packing itself deeper against the door, and the small stove burning its patient, disciplined fire. The widow kept the count with a stub of charcoal, marking the timber above her pallet. A single stroke for each morning she woke to the sound of wind. She learned the rhythm of survival down there, the heating of the stones every few hours, the careful feeding of the fire, never too much, never too little, the measured eating of the beans. She learned to live small and slow and warm. And on the fourth day, the wind stopped. The silence it left behind was so complete, it had a weight to it. She lay still on the pallet for several minutes, uncertain whether her hearing had changed or the world had. Then she rose and pushed the door slab open against the resistance of the snow that had packed against it, working with the shovel until she had cleared enough to climb out. And she stood in a light so sharp it functioned less like light than like a physical force. The sky was a color blue had no business being. That deep, empty, depthless blue of a sky that had burned all its moisture away. Below her, the valley lay buried. The flats, the road, the creek bed, all of it erased under a white so uniform it swallowed every ordinary distinction. The shapes of the buildings in town registered only as soft mounds. Their hard angles surrendered to the general whiteness, and from those mounds, almost no smoke. 2 chimneys, maybe. 3. And the smoke that did rise came thin and tentative. The smoke of people burning whatever they had left. She stood there only a little while, long enough to breathe air that was clean and cold as ground glass, long enough to confirm the vent pipes were clear and the door seal had held. Then she went back down into the warmth, and she thought about the mounds in the valley, about the thin smoke, about the people living under all that white, growing colder by the hour. The first one came on the 12th night after the wind broke. She heard him before she understood it was a hymn, a sound from above, not the wind, not the settling of snow, something purposeful, a scraping, then a pattern her mind slowly resolved into boots, working through the deep crust, then a voice, ragged with cold. "Ma'am, please, if you can hear me." She took up the axe out of long habit before she pushed the door open, and there, collapsed into the snow above the entrance, was a man she half knew from the valley. Cole Renner. His coat was wrong for the cold, too thin, a working coat, not a winter one. The kind of mistake a man makes when he puts things away in a mild season and finds himself, later, in a harder winter than the one he remembered. Behind him, huddled together under a single inadequate blanket, were 2 children. A boy, perhaps 6. A girl, smaller, 4 maybe. Their faces were the color of cold wax. The widow did not waste a breath on questions. She reached up, took the girl first, passed her down the steps into the warmth, went back for the boy, then helped the man himself descend, his legs barely holding him. Inside the tent, the children sat wordless in the warmth. Their eyes moved from the small stove to the placid shape of the mare in the outer chamber, to the widow's face, with a wide, processing look of very young people meeting something their world had not yet made room for. She gave them bean broth from the pot, heated to just below scalding, in the 2 tin cups her father had stored in the crate. The girl wrapped both hands around her cup and bent her head over it as if the steam itself were medicine. The widow watched them drink, and something in her chest, which had been closed and hard for weeks, opened by a small degree. Cole told her the shape of it in pieces, between the shivers that still moved through him in waves. The roof had given way in the back room, under the weight of the snow. His wife was home, laid low with a fever that had been climbing for days. The wood was gone. Not low. Gone. He had burned the kitchen table 2 nights before. He had heard, from a neighbor who had heard from another, that there was smoke rising from the hill above the old place, that somehow the widow was alive up there, alive in the cold that had killed livestock in the valley and frozen wells solid. He looked at her across the dim, warm space, and she knew the look of a man who has run all the way to the end of his own resources and arrived at the edge of someone else's, not knowing whether what he is about to ask will be given or refused, knowing only that he has no other door left to try. She gave him broth. She gave the children a corner of the blanket tent and let them sleep. She gave the man warmth and time and did not ask him to be grateful for it. And then, when the shivering had eased and the color had begun to come back into the children's faces, she did the thing that mattered more than any of it. She took a flat piece of stone from the floor and a stub of charcoal from beside the stove, and she drew the firebox in cross-section, the flue, the intake pipe, and the exhaust pipe, labeled with letters so he could not confuse them the way she nearly had in the dark, and nearly died for it. She drew the cold sink trench, the way to bank earth against the door, the method of hanging blankets to make a smaller room within a room, and she explained, her voice level, her words plain, moving from principle to practice without a wasted breath. Cold air is heavy. It settles. Give it somewhere to go. Low pipe draws the cold in. High pipe lets the warm out. Get them backward, and the smoke will try to kill you. Get them right, and the fire will keep you alive. Cole watched, his shivering gradually stilling as the warmth worked through him, his eyes tracking the diagram with the focused attention of a man who understood that his family's survival now depended on what he learned in the next little while. When she finished, she handed him the stone. "Draw it back," she told him. He drew it. Badly at first. She corrected him. He drew it again. And again. By the 3rd time, it was accurate enough to build from. She gave him the full sack of beans. She gave him 2 candles and the spare length of rope and a flint she found in the lower drawer of the crate. She kept the matches for herself, but everything else that could be spared, she pressed into his hands. He stood to leave, the children wrapped in the blanket she gave them, his eyes carrying something new. Not gratitude, exactly. Gratitude was too simple a word for it. Something more like a changed understanding. The look of a man who has discovered that what he thought was a gift was actually an instruction. "I don't know how to thank you for this," he said. She met his eyes. You build what I showed you," she said, "and you show the next person who comes to your door." She paused. "That's how it works." He left before the next dark, picking his way down the slope with the children, the diagram stone tucked inside his coat against his chest, like something sacred. And the widow stood at the mouth of her father's shelter and watched them go, small dark shapes moving across all that white. She understood, watching them, something she had not fully understood before. Her father had not left her enough for one woman to survive a hard winter. He had left her more than that. Far more. Sacks and barrels and tools past what any single person could use. The excess had always been part of the design. Knowledge that saved only its holder was knowledge poorly used. He had known that. He had built it into the very size of the store he left. He had not just prepared her to live. He had prepared her to give. Others came after him. A father with a frost-bitten boy, the child's ears gone white at the tips. She warmed them the careful way. No rubbing, no direct heat, just the chamber's steady air and time, and fed them, and taught the father the diagram, and sent them home, able to build. Families she half knew from the valley. Each one she warmed and fed and taught, and required to draw the diagram back before they left. And then came the older man, the one who had stood at the front of the church on Sundays, telling his people that Providence would provide. He came humbled, burning his own church furniture to keep his wife's cough from turning to something worse. He sat across from the widow in the dim, warm chamber, his hands folded between his knees. "I told them Providence would provide," he said, quiet. "I believe that now, more than I did before." He looked at the stove, at the pipes, at the plain, patient order of the place. "I just understand the mechanism a little differently." She gave him the same diagram, the same instruction, the same requirement that he be able to draw it back before he left. The knowledge moved outward from her, into the valley, replicating itself in stone and clay, and the careful labor of hands that had never done such work before. And the shelter her father built for one woman became, in that hard season, the thing that kept a whole scattered community from freezing in the dark. But the cold that season did not give without taking. And what it came for, in the end, was the one warm living thing the widow had left. The mare had been quieter for a day or two, eating less, standing more still than usual. The cold that the widow had managed to hold at bay through the worst of the weeks was pressing harder now, finding the small inefficiencies in the insulation she had not been able to fully correct. She went out to check on her one evening and put her hand on the animal's neck, and she did not feel the warm, living heat of a healthy horse. She felt something diminished, as if the cold had found its way inside from a direction the stone and earth could not reach. She stayed with the mare through that night. She brought more boughs and packed them tighter against the outer walls. She moved the last heated stone from her own sleeping space into the horse's corner. By morning, the breathing had steadied, but the next night was colder still. And she knew, by the second morning, with the same quiet certainty, she knew a joint would not hold, or a beam had rot in its center, that she was not going to be able to save the horse from what was coming. Not hope, not fear, just a plain reading of what was there. The mare had been old when they came up the hill. She had carried the widow and her father before her across 10,000 ordinary days. She had stood patient in weather and in noise. She had lived the whole of her long life in the uncomplaining, dignified way of a working animal that asks for nothing except competence from the person in charge of her. She died before dawn, quietly, in the outer chamber, with the widow's hand resting on her neck. There was no struggle at the end, just a long breath let out and not drawn back, and then a stillness that was different from every stillness that had come before it. The widow sat with her a while in the dark, not moving. She had faced the loss of the land and the betrayal of the town and the false paper and the fire on her fence and the long cold, and she had met all of it with that hard, clear steadiness her father had built into her. But this was something else. This was the last warm thing that had known her father. The last creature that had stood in the yard on mornings when he was still alive to come out with a handful of oats and call her name. And with the mare gone, some final thread connecting the widow to the life she'd had before, to the world with her father still in it, went quiet too. She allowed herself to understand that she was grieving. She did not push it away. She did not put it to work the way she put everything to work. She let herself stand in the underground dark for exactly as long as it took to feel the full weight of what she had lost. The tears came, and this time she did not scold herself for them. She had learned in this hard season that grief was not weakness, that a person could weep for what they loved and be no less able to do what came next. The two were not opposites. They never had been. She could not dig in the frozen ground, so she did the only thing there was to do. She moved the mare with great effort, working alone in the bitter cold, out through the entrance and into the deep snow. She packed the snow around the body to hold it until the spring would let her do better. And she found a flat stone near the entrance and set it at the head. It was not a burial, not really. It was the best she could do. Then she went back inside and sealed the door and stood in the outer chamber. It was quieter now, the specific living warmth of the animal gone. Replace it by a simple cold that the physics of the place could manage. But it felt different, emptier, in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. She went to the stove, added 2 logs, waited for the heat to build, held her hands out to it. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do. The stone did not mourn. The earth did not pause in its long, slow holding of summer's warmth. She had things to build, people to teach, a name to find, written in her father's hand, and a document in an oilskin pouch against her ribs that meant this cold, however long it intended to last, had already lost. The hardest cold of the season came without warning. The sky went brilliant and cloudless, which was the cruelest part of it. All that apparent clarity, all that false promise of a better day, and the temperatures dropping to a depth that turned unprotected metal brittle and froze the creek solid to its bed. Inside the hill, the widow's system held. The snow above the chamber had grown deep now, 4 feet, then more. An insulating mass that held the ground's warmth in place with a thoroughness no amount of burning wood could match from above. The main chamber held steady, warm as a mild spring day, while the world above went to a cold that would kill a person in an hour. In the tent, with the disciplined fire and the heated stones, warmer still. And in that warmth, word reached her of the thing she had been waiting for. Halliday had come to check on her. It arrived as a report, carried up the hill by Cole Renner, who had taken to visiting now and then, bringing news from the valley along with a share of whatever he could spare. His own shelter, built from her diagram, was holding fine. His wife was on her feet again. The children slept warm. And 2 other families, he told her, had built from the diagram he'd carried down. 2 more were building now. The knowledge was moving, just as her father had meant it to. But Cole brought a warning, too. Halliday had been asking around town about the hill, about how many ways there were up it, about whether any of the neighbors had been in contact with the widow they'd all believed had fled. He had learned she was alive up there, and it did not sit well with a man who had built such a careful machine to make her disappear. "He's not waiting on the weather anymore," Cole said. "That's the feeling I get. He waited on the cold to do his work, and the cold didn't." The widow listened, and she took the information and set it alongside everything else she was holding. The pouch against her ribs, the 2 names on the true document. The old man kept warm behind a curtain in the back of a store. She had one piece she could not yet play, and she was not yet in the position to play it. But the board was becoming clearer by the day. "How's your stove holding?" she asked. Cole almost smiled. "Holding fine. Better than fine." She nodded. The knowledge was outward now, moving from hand to hand, saving people she would never meet. That was the thing her father had understood, that Halliday never would. A machine built to isolate one woman could not account for a woman who gave everything away. Then Halliday made his move. It came at the worst of the cold. On a night the sky was hard and clear and full of pitiless stars. Cole's lantern appeared on the slope in the small hours, swinging in a pattern he had set up between them as a warning. The widow was outside before he reached the entrance. "3 men," Cole said, breathing hard, the cold tearing at his words. "Coming up the north approach. I saw them cross the creek in my line. They've got sacks, burlap sacks, packed with snow." She understood at once what the sacks were for. The vent pipes. Fit a snow-packed sack over the openings from above, and you sealed them. Sealed pipes meant no draw. No draw meant no fire. No fire meant no heat. In that cold, a person below would have a few hours, no more. It was elementary in its brutality. It required no forged paper, no judge, no lawyer, just 3 men and some burlap, and the willingness to let the cold do what a court would not. Halliday had stopped trying to make her disappear on paper. He had decided to let the winter finish her for real, but he had not accounted for Cole Renner, or for the diagram moving hand to hand through the valley, or for the simple fact that a woman who gives everything away is no longer a woman standing alone. Cole raised the rifle he'd carried up the slope, pointed it at the hard sky above the tree line, and fired. The shot carried in the cold with a clean, flat authority. It did not echo. It arrived complete. A single declarative statement that the night received without comment, and the night answered. The older man from the church heard it, from his rebuilt shelter on the far side of town. 2 half-grown boys heard it, from the claim their father had been working since the widow taught him the method. Within a short while, 3 lanterns appeared on the slope, their light crossing the snow toward the hill from different directions. Coming up, Halliday's men saw them coming, and they turned and went back down the way they'd come before anyone reached them. The retreat was not a defeat in any legal sense. No law had been broken that could be proven. No paper had changed hands. But it had been seen by people who lived in the valley, who knew the hill, who understood exactly what an attempt to block those pipes on a night that cold was meant to do. It was not a failure of a plan. It was a confession delivered to witnesses, and witnesses in a small valley have long memories. When the last lantern had gone, and the slope was quiet again, the widow stood a while in the killing cold, looking down at the valley, at the scattered points of light, where her diagram burned warm in shelters built by hands that had learned from hers. She was not alone up here. That was the thing Halliday had never understood, and never would. He had counted on her isolation. He had built his whole machine on it, and she had spent the winter dismantling it, one diagram at a time, one family at a time, one flat stone drawn in charcoal and handed across a warm, dark room at a time. She went back down into the shelter. She fed the stove. She heated a stone. She lay down on the pallet where, not long ago, an old gray mare had breathed her warmth into the dark. The grief was still there. It would be there a long while, but under it, steady as the ground itself, was something the cold could not reach, and Halliday could not touch, and no false paper could ever undo. She had survived the thing meant to kill her. She had turned a shelter into a lifeline for a whole valley, and somewhere below, behind a curtain, an old man who had signed the truth was still alive, still waiting. The winter had done its worst, and she was still here. The cold could not last forever. Nothing could that spent itself so hard. And in the deep quiet of the shelter, the widow felt the season begin at last to loosen its grip. She heard it first in the pipe. The intake had whistled all through the worst of it, a thin, urgent note that had become the sound of the siege itself. And one morning she woke and the whistle was gone. In its place, a different sound. Water. Somewhere above, the smallest trickle of it, finding its way down through the snow. The ground was letting go. She did not rush up to meet it. She had learned patience from the stone and from the man who had cut this room out of the hill for her. She emerged in stages, a little more each day, assessing what the winter had done and what it had left standing. The snow drew back from the south-facing slopes first, running in thin, clear channels that cut new routes through the softening ground. And below, in the valley, the smoke began to change. Where there had been 2 thin threads, there were now a dozen, and they rose steady and confident, from shelters that had held, in homes where people had made it through. She counted them one morning, standing at the mouth of her father's shelter, and for each one, she knew the hands that had built it, or knew the hands that had taught the hands that built it. The knowledge had moved further than she could see now, past the families she'd taught, into homes she'd never entered, built by people who had never once climbed her hill, working from diagrams that were second-hand, and third, copies of the flat stone she'd drawn in the dark. She had saved people she would never meet, and she understood, standing there in the first soft air of the thaw, that this was the thing that would outlast all the rest. Longer than the false paper, longer than the man who had signed it, longer even than her. Cole Renner came up the slope a few days later. He moved differently than the man who had collapsed at her door in the depth of the cold. He moved like someone who had learned the slope, who had crossed it 100 times now, in every kind of weather, and had nothing left to fear from it. His coat was heavier. He'd added an outer layer of canvas, roughly stitched, the mark of a man who had learned to solve his problems with what he had, rather than wait for something better. She met him at the entrance, and before he could speak, she handed him a folded piece of brown paper torn from a provision sack. A few words, in her clearest hand. The old man in the back room. "I know who he is. I need him. Bring him if he can travel." Cole read it. He looked up, and something in his face told her she had been right. About all of it. About the scrape of a chair, and the cup carried to a cat that did not exist. and the name written in her father's hand. "She's been feeding him since before the first snow," Cole said, meaning Della. "Keeping him in the back, out of sight." The widow waited. "2 men came around before the cold set in," Cole went on. "Said the old man was needed. Some proceeding, far off, about the title to this land. Della's father understood what that meant. If a man like Halliday needed him to appear somewhere, the only reason was to make sure he never appeared anywhere again." The widow closed her eyes for a moment. The old man, Josiah, Della's own father. That was the shape of it. That was why the coldness at the counter and the warmth in the back room had been the same thing all along. Della had suspended a lifelong neighbor's credit with her eyes on a shelf to keep suspicion off the one man she was hiding. She had let herself look small and hard and complicit to protect the one witness who could undo everything. She had chosen to be misunderstood, because being understood would have cost her father his life. "Can he travel?" the widow asked. Cole considered it with the seriousness the question deserved. "He walked 3 miles the week before the first storm. His legs still work." A pause. "His mind's sharp as it ever was. Sharper, maybe. A man who knows he's the last one left who saw a thing tends to keep himself organized around it." The widow nodded. "Then bring him," she said, "when the road allows. Carefully. Halliday's still watching." Cole tucked the paper away and went back down the slope. And the widow stood at the mouth of the shelter and let herself feel, for the first time, the full weight of what was about to become possible. Halliday came to the hill before Josiah could. She heard him coming. The particular aggression of a man forcing his way through heavy snow rather than working with it. The sound of effort applied without technique, without patience. She was at the entrance when he appeared over the crest, alone, his face red with cold above the collar of his coat. He stopped some distance from the entrance and looked at the door slab, and the vent pipes, and the plain physical fact of her survival arranged before him. And something moved across his face. Fury, disbelief, and underneath those, the specific outrage of a man who has built a careful plan and found it running up against a reality that does not recognize his plan's authority. "I know you've got something up here," he said. His voice had lost its earlier register. The smooth, legal calm was gone. What was left was barer and more honest and uglier. "Whatever Elias left, it belongs to the estate. You're sitting on my land, in a hole on my property. Whatever papers you think you've got, they've already been beaten, stamped and recorded and affirmed. You've got nothing." The widow stood at the entrance, her hands at her sides. She let him finish. And then she asked him the question she had been holding since the night she first looked at his false paper in the lamplight of her father's table. "Did you know," she said slowly, "that my father's right thumb never healed straight?" Halliday stared at her. "After a bad winter, long ago, working iron in the cold, it broke and it set wrong, and it never came right again." She held his eyes. He couldn't make a clean, unbroken curve after that. Not with a pen, not with anything. His hand simply wouldn't do it. The question hung in the cold air between them, and she watched his face for the thing she needed to see. Not guilt. Guilt was too simple. The specific blankness of a man encountering information he had never thought to obtain. He had not known. She saw it, plain as a crack running through stone. He had hired a forger, given him a name, checked the result against a signature from years before, when the hand was still whole, and found it close enough. He had done everything his plan required. He had simply never spent a single day laying stone beside Elias Calloway, never watched that broken thumb change the angle of every stroke the man made for the rest of his life. And so the one thing that could unmake his forgery, the history of a hand, had never even been available to him. His blankness lasted only a moment. Then his face reset, and he reached for what was left to him. "Sign the relinquishment," he said. And now his voice carried only the bare current of what he wanted. 10 acres, northeast corner, enough to build on. You can live out your years on Calloway land, which is more than the law requires me to give you. The widow looked at him with the same steady attention she brought to a stone wall. She was reading him, the way she read a fire, or a pipe, or a joint that might not hold. And what she read was a man who had reached the bottom of his arguments. "My father built something up here," she said, "that you can't take from me." A pause. "Because you can't understand it well enough to know what it is." She stepped back into the entrance and took the edge of the door slab in both hands. "Go home, Mr. Halliday. Bank your foundation with snow. Pack straw in your wall joints. Your firewood will last longer." And she pulled the door closed. She heard him on the slope a while longer. Boots and snow going nowhere in mounting frustration. Then departure. Then nothing. The road opened before the last of the snow was gone, and Cole brought the old man up the hill. Josiah moved slowly, but without apology. A large-framed man, reduced by age to something still substantial, his white hair visible beneath the brim of a hat that had been good once, his eyes under brows gone completely white, the clear, undeceived brown of a man who had stopped performing calm and simply arrived at it. Della had wrapped him in 3 layers, the outermost an old buffalo coat that had belonged to her grandfather. He wore it without irony, because warmth was warmth. He came down the stone steps with Cole's hand at his elbow, and at the bottom he stopped and looked around the chamber with the attentiveness of a man who appreciated good work. He pressed his palm flat against the stone wall. "Elias built this," he said. "Not a question. You can tell a man's work from the way he fits a corner. Elias never once left a corner he wasn't satisfied with." The widow sat him down on the flat stone she used as a seat, and she took out the pouch and laid the true certificate on the crate between them. Josiah looked at it a long moment without touching it. Then he reached out with his right hand. A large hand, the knuckles swollen, but the finger still precise, and set his index finger on his own signature. "Elias had been on this land a good while before this was signed," he said. "He wanted it done proper. There were 2 of us there to witness, myself and another man, gone now, some years back." He looked up. "Which leaves me." She asked him then, quietly, if he would go before the court and say what he had just said to her. He looked at her across the dim chamber with the expression of a man who has been waiting a long time for a particular question, and is relieved, at last, to hear it asked. "Young woman," he said, "I have spent this whole hard season sitting in the back of a store, eating my daughter's cooking, which is good, but wears thin, specifically so that I would still be alive to answer that question." A pause. Yes, I will go. She told him there was one more thing he needed to be ready for. She told him it would not be enough to simply confirm his signature, that Halliday's lawyer would come for his credibility, his age, his memory, the fact that he'd been hidden away in a back room, undisclosed to anyone, which would be made to look like a scheme. She told him he would need to speak not just to the paper, but to the hand, to her father's hand, the broken thumb, the specific thing it could no longer do. Josiah was quiet a moment. Then he told her. He told her about the days he and Elias had spent laying the foundation of the cabin long ago, how he'd done the corner work, and Elias kept quietly repositioning his stones, not out of arrogance, but because Elias could see the load paths better than any man he'd ever worked beside. He told her about the thumb, broken in a stonework accident one hard winter, never set straight. How Elias had held his hammer differently ever after, and how the grip changed the angle of every stroke. A man who signed that false deed, Josiah said, needed a hand that could make a full, clean, unbroken curve. Elias, after that winter, did not have that hand. He never did again. He looked at her steadily, and then, softer, something crossed his face that had nothing to do with the case. You have his hands, you know. I saw it the moment you set that stone under me for a seat. The same grip, the same patience. He'd have been proud of the work you did in this hill. The words settled into the chamber like stones set by a careful hand, and the widow, who had not been called by her own name in weeks, who had been only the widow to a whole valley that needed her, felt something loosen in her chest at the sound of being seen as her father's daughter. "Cora," she said after a moment, quietly, because he had earned the knowing of it. "My father called me Cora." The old man nodded, slow and grave, as if she had handed him something precious to keep. "Then I'll say it right, Cora Calloway, when the time comes." The hearing came in the soft, muddy heart of the spring. The room held more people than it had chairs for. Cole Renner stood against the back wall. The older man from the church took a seat near the front, his hands folded, his face carrying that reassessed understanding of how the world worked. Other families from the valley filled what space remained. They had come through the mud on horses thinner than they'd been at the start of the cold, to stand in a room and be counted on the widow's side. She sat at the table, the oilskin pouch in front of her, unopened. Josiah sat beside her, dressed in the best of what he owned, a collar pressed clean by his daughter's hand. Halliday came with a lawyer from far off, a man who wore his suit with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most prepared person in any room. The judge was a lean, careful man, with a reputation for an almost physical resistance to being moved by anything but the evidence in front of him. He had affirmed Halliday's transfer once on the strength of paper that had been thorough and correctly stamped. He was not a corrupt man. He was a careful man who had been carefully deceived, and there was a quality to his attention now that suggested he had spent the intervening months wondering. The lawyer worked with efficiency. He questioned the true certificate. It had not been kept in any official record, he noted, but in the possession of the claimant herself, which raised obvious questions about its integrity. He turned to Josiah and went for the old man's credibility with everything he had, his age, his memory, subject to the erosions of time, the fact that he'd been hidden in a back room, undisclosed to any official, which surely suggested a coordinated scheme, Josiah listened to all of it with the stillness of stone, and when the judge invited him to respond, he rose slowly from his chair. With the deliberate respect of a man who understood that certain moments require a person to stand upright for them, he did not raise his voice. He placed his right hand flat on the table, spread the fingers, looked at them a moment, then looked up. "I have worked stone since I was a young man," he said. "I am old now. In all that time, I have worked beside a great many men in a great many conditions, and I remember their hands, because hands are how a stone man knows another stone man." He paused. The angle of a grip tells you what a man can do, what he has done, and what has been done to him. He looked at the false document, not with contempt, with the plain, dispassionate attention of a man examining a joint that had been set wrong. I remember Elias Calloway's hands because I helped him lay the foundation of the cabin on that property. His right thumb had been broken, and it never sat in alignment. It sat at a deviation from its natural axis for the rest of his life. It changed every gripping motion he ever made after that. And it changed his signature. He looked at the judge. The name on that transfer was made by a hand that could produce a clean, unbroken curve. I will tell this court, under any oath it cares to give me, that the hand I knew could not have made that stroke, not on the date it claims, not on any date after that winter. A silence. The hand simply did not have it in it anymore. The room held its silence. The particular silence a room holds when something has been said that everyone present understands, in the plain sense of the word, to be true. The judge looked at the two signatures side by side for a long, measured interval. He looked at Josiah, and he looked at Halliday, who was looking down at the table now, with the expression of a man arriving at a full accounting of the cost of a decision made in a moment of confident miscalculation. The lawyer tried twice more, but his arguments had lost their frame. They fell apart even as he made them, and the widow did not speak again. She did not need to. Josiah had said the only thing that needed saying, and he had said it with the precision of a man who had spent a lifetime learning to look at a piece of work and tell the truth about it. The ruling came down. The transfer nullified. The title restored. The false paper entered into the record for what it was, and Halliday referred on to answer for the forgery he had used to try to take a dead man's land from his daughter. He did not fight the ruling. He sat with his hands folded until the room had largely emptied. Then he rose with the movement of a man whose resources had been spent on a thing that had failed, and walked out into the spring mud without a word to anyone. He sold what he still held in the valley before the summer was out, and he went east, taking what capital was left to him, and did not come back. The large, drafty house he had appropriated stood empty a while, until a family bought it, and pulled the green lumber apart, and rebuilt it with seasoned wood that would not shrink and gap in the cold. And they stayed, and it became a home again. The sheriff, who had ridden up that first day with his eyes on a place he wished he were instead, served on after that with the particular conscientiousness of a man working off a debt to a place he had wronged. And on the days he rode past the widow's land and saw her working it, he removed his hat. It was not a performance. It was the only apology he was capable of making that matched the size of what he owed. The land came back to Cora in the spring, when the ground was soft enough to take a spade without a fight. she did not celebrate. She went to work. The cabin roof needed mending. The barn corner. The fence line where the fire had eaten 3 rails and a post in the deep of the winter. Her hands moved with the old competence, the old economy of motion. The understanding that a thing done well requires only the labor it requires, nothing more. But the shelter on the hill, she did not fill it in, or seal it, or treat it as a thing finished and done. She kept it, and over the years she made it better. A proper stone chimney, in time, to replace the hollowed log. A small window, cut through the hillside with great effort, to let in a little south light. A shelf along one wall, for books. The main chamber held its steady warmth through every season that came after. Warm in the deep of winter, cool in the heat of summer. Keeping the bargain her father had made with the ground on a summer afternoon, long before she understood what he was building, and when the cold came round again each year. The people came, not in the desperation of that first hard season, but deliberately, with their tools and their families, and the specific, purposeful attention of people acquiring a knowledge they intended to keep. She taught each of them the same way, the same principles, in the same order, the same requirement at the end. Draw it back for me, from memory, then teach the next person who needs it. The knowledge moved outward from her hill, across the county, and past it, into places she would never see, carried by hands that had learned it from hands that had learned it from hers. Families who never once met her built their shelters from diagrams 3 and 4 times removed from the flat stone she'd drawn in the dark of that first winter. The knowledge saved people she would never know. In winters she would not live to see. That was the payoff her father had built toward all those years ago. Not a woman surviving, a woman becoming a source. And here is the quiet thing, the thing that mattered most in the end. The winter had not simply been survived. It had been transformed into a gift that kept on giving itself, hand to hand, long after the giver had gone still. Cora Calloway grew old on that land, the hands first, thickening at the joints, the way a stoneworker's hands do. Her eyes stayed clear. Her back stayed straight. And she never acquired the habit of explaining herself to people who had not yet earned the explanation. She lived the whole of her long life in the uncomplaining, dignified manner of a person who asks nothing except competence from herself, and gives everything she has, freely, to those who come to her door in the cold. She was not, in the end, the sum of a false paper, or a hard winter, or a court that finally set things right. She was the carrier of a certain kind of knowledge, and the knowledge outlived her. Long after, on a bright summer afternoon, a boy clearing brush on the western slope of the hill caught his boot heel on something solid beneath the overgrowth. He pulled back the grass with his hands, a flat stone, large, fitted into the hillside with a precision that did not look like the work of weather. He called for help, and together, 2 of them worked the slab free, using a fence post for a lever, the stone grinding as it moved against the earth that had held it so long. The air that came up from below was cool, steady, smelling of nothing in particular, or rather, smelling of time, which has a scent all its own. The scent of the absence of ordinary scents. The boy went down first, into the dark, and what he found was a room. Straight walls, still true, tight-fitted stone, a small stove, cold now, sitting patient on its base. A wooden crate against the far wall, its lid intact. Inside the crate, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff with the years, were a few plain objects: a tin cup, a whetstone, a folded piece of brown paper, and beneath them, an oilskin pouch. Inside it, brown with age but perfectly legible, 2 documents, an old certificate of title, and a single sheet in a careful, deliberate hand. If you found this, you know what the paper means. Find Josiah. The boy did not understand it. Not really. Not the way it deserved to be understood. But he understood that a life had been lived here, that someone had built this room with great care, against some hard hour, and left these things behind for a reason. He held the old certificate up to the light coming down the steps, and he felt, standing in that cool and constant air, a room that had held its warmth and its stillness through every season since it was sealed, something he could not have named. The presence of a person who had trusted the ground, who had trusted stone and patience and the plain physics of a thing built right, more than she had ever trusted the promises of men, and who had left in the earth itself a proof that would keep long after the paper in any office had yellowed and been forgotten. The boy climbed back out into the summer light. He left the crate as he'd found it. Some instinct told him to. The slab went back into place, and the hill looked as it always had, a slope of grass rising toward a wide and open sky. But below it, in the cool and the constant dark, the ground remembered. It had always remembered, and it always would.